Yeah, thank you, Neil, for that introduction. And I'm very excited to be here. And thank you for having me here. So I'm going to talk about this latest work called PROF, which stands for Protected Order Flow. And the model for this work is we want to be operating in a rational model where the validators and all the other entities are self-interested. We don't want to make any assumptions about honest majority and so on. Okay. So the setting for this work is MEV, or maximal extractable value. MEV, just I'm sure many are familiar here with it, so I'll not belabor the point, but just very briefly, MEV is basically the ability of a validator to um, reorder transactions in a block, censor transactions in a block, or insert their own transactions such that they can extract the maximum amount of value for themselves. And this was first observed in 2019 in this landmark paper called Flash Boys 2.0, where they were observing that already these games are being played on the blockchain by rational actors. Okay, so since then, this topic has been very hotly debated, and there have been various approaches that have been taken by the community. I'd like to focus on two broad approaches that the community has taken, and in some sense, these two approaches are quite radically different from each other. That's why I have this diverging paths representing these two approaches here. So the first one is what I call systematization of value extraction. So in this approach, the community assumes that, okay, extraction is inevitable. We can't do anything about it because validators are rational entities. And so might as well just focus on democratizing this extraction because some validators have more ability to extract and some validators have less ability to extract. So might as well just also kind of equip the less sophisticated validators to be able to extract as much value as a sophisticated validator. Okay. So this systematically gives every validator access to the most profitable block that is on offer. And this approach is largely called proposer-builder separation because now there's a separation between proposers who are looking to propose the most profitable block and builders who are these out-of-protocol entities that are supplying these validators in a marketplace the most profitable block. So the thing to notice here is that often the rewards that are being accrued to the validators in PBS, these rewards do come at the expense of ordinary users. And this leaves ordinary users susceptible to or vulnerable to systematic extraction of value from their transactions. This can be in the form of front running or forced liquidations, censorship, or any of those. So this is a schematic to kind of just represent the power balance here. The validators have a lot of power in this system. They can decide which blocks to accept, how to reorder users' transactions, which transactions to censor, which transactions to insert. And ordinary users have no say in how their transactions are being processed. And in fact, this approach has taken quite a hold in the industry. As you can see on the right, most of the blocks, in fact, 90%, 95% of the blocks are being actually proposed through this mechanism, the PBS mechanism. And very few blocks are now being proposed without this mechanism. In some sense, this validates the model that this approach advocates for, which is that validators are rational entities, and they would just go for whichever mechanisms gives them the most profitable block. So I just wanted to put it out there that in some sense, this approach is validated in industry. The second approach is mostly academic in nature so far. This approach is what I call fair ordering. There are two broad variants of it, two broad categories. The first broad category is temporal fair ordering. And in this approach, it doesn't take MEV as a given. And this approach instead tries to minimize the value that can be extracted from users' transactions. Roughly said, this approach says, if sufficiently many nodes receive transaction 1 before transaction 2, then all honest nodes must output transaction 1 before transaction 2. So in some sense, you have a decentralized protocol that is guaranteeing that the protocol is robust to some sort of front running, so to say. So this is the temporal fair ordering category of fair ordering. The other category that is there, which is complementary to temporal fair ordering, is blind ordering. Here, the guarantee is that transaction contents are only revealed publicly once those transactions are finalized. The transaction sequence is finalized through consensus, and then you can reveal what the transaction contents are. This ordering can be enforced either through MPC, threshold encryption, or trusted execution environments, which would basically finalize transactions first and then reveal the transactions. And it turns out you could also make these approaches complementary to each other. They are not exclusive. So you could both encrypt the transactions and have a decentralized protocol that is fairly ordering those transactions in a temporal way. Okay, this is all nice and good. This approach, in fact, has a very large line of academic literature behind it. So there have been a plethora of papers that have been published on fair ordering and blind ordering in the last few years. But this approach has largely been confined to academia and has not seen adoption in practice. One big reason for that is while this approach has protection for users, this approach essentially does not account for rational model of validators. Um, Put differently, this approach does not factor into the fact that why would a rational validator opt into this approach if they can just make much more money extracting value from users' transactions. So unless the protocol forces the validators to uh, follow this protocol, a rational validator would never adopt a fair ordering approach and forego their profits that they are getting from proposer builder separation.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please feel free to interrupt me.
So what do you think about, because now it's irrational maybe in terms of short-term profit. But if you think about long-term profit, if there is two blockchains that compete and one going to give a fair ordering and will kind of attract users to use it, so the validators in that network in the long run can do better. So in some sense, maybe it can explain why L2 solutions, when you have a centralized validator, try to promote this kind of ideas, no? Like,
yeah, that's a great point. I think if I think about L2 chains, Arbitrum already does fair sequencing. Um, so that's a great point. And that's something that would be interesting to see, how the kind of competitiveness evolves around these two approaches. But at least so far, what we have seen on Ethereum, at least, the short-term nature of PBS has won out in some sense. That could be for a variety of reasons, maybe because, validators do not have the ability to look too much into the future. They just know that they are assigned the current slot. So just as well, just might as well optimize for the current slot. Who knows what will happen in the future? Versus the L2 example that you quoted, there's a centralized sequencer which has in some sense security about the future, and it knows that it's going to be there for a long time. But that's a good point.
yeah.
So
Okay.
whenever I say rational here, I do mean short-term sighted or myopic behavior.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. So the way I represent this, the power balance here is that users would be happy in this approach, but miners or validators have no incentives to jump on it, at least a short-term incentive to adopt this. And there's a slight asterisk here as well, which is this approach does have an externality. This externality, if you are doing temporal fair ordering, then there's some sort of latency racing that is incentivized, where if you can connect to a majority of the nodes, then you can get your transaction sequence to before other transactions. So there's some sort of HFT-like, high frequency trading like, or latency racing kind of externality that might come up here. So we will also talk about handling that as well in PROF. Okay, so having presented this context, let me now present to you how PROF strikes a balance between the two. So the practical question that we ask in this work is, can users get protection from the most pernicious forms of MEV? I want to be clear that not all MEV is harmful to users. Like, for example, arbitrage across two exchanges is needed for a well-functioning market. But other forms of harmful MEV like sandwiches, front running, forced liquidations, and so on, can we get protection from those kind of pernicious forms of MEV while accounting for validators who will only act in their self-interest? In some sense, we want to kind of restore the power balance and also have validators opt into this mechanism. So as I said already, as I hinted, this approach is in some sense combining the two approaches that have been taken so far, which is the PBS approach and the fair ordering approach. So Prof, to summarize the properties of the mechanism, it's quite simple, as you would see, very simple, at least logically. We'll discuss a lot of details there, but at a high level, it's a very simple mechanism. The most important part of it is it's also backward compatible because it's designed from the first day to be practical, deployable friendly. So it's backward compatible with the current architecture of Ethereum. And as I said, the two properties that we want out of such a mechanism is it should protect users without service degradation. So I'll talk about what service degradation might happen. And the last one is, of course, we want to account for rational validators. Okay. So here's a design summary for PROF. What PROF does is it takes these protected transactions or protected order flow. These transactions should ideally be exclusively sent to PROF. Transactions that are floating around in the mempool can also use PROF, but if you have already sent your transaction to mempool, in some sense, you have kind of foregone protection. But transactions are directly sent to this PROF box here. PROF assembles these transactions into what we call a PROF bundle, and these transactions are assembled in a fair way. We'll talk about what fairness means here. You can have different notions of fairness, but whatever is your favorite notion of fairness, these transactions are assembled in a fair way. Now, what PROF does is it takes a block B that's constructed through some other mechanism like PBS, and it appends to this block the PROF fairly ordered bundle to get an enriched block B star. The idea here is that if the original block B is giving a reward R to the validator, the block B star will only give a higher reward to the validator because we are not changing the execution of the original blue block that's executed as it is from top to bottom. And then we have some additional epsilon fee that might be paid by the PROF transactions. And as a result, you have a little bit of higher reward for the validator. So in some sense, an enrichment is happening through PROF with the help of the fee that is there in the PROF transactions. Note that this PROF bundle is fairly ordered, so there is no kind of sandwiching and front running and so on. These transactions are kept private, as we'll see. So the only thing that these transactions will do is basically just pay an epsilon fee to the validator. Now, from a
Can I ask a question?
perspective, yeah, please
Sorry.
go ahead.
I think here the incentive idea is that, you know, since there is an extra epsilon, the validators will be happy enough to take the enriched block instead of the original block. How do we think about, you know, if this is instead of like a one-time interaction, but a, you know, continuous interaction between PROF mechanism and the block builders. You can imagine if more order flows goes to PROF, then potentially there will be less order that could be front run by the block builder themselves. So then their reward R dynamically over time will decrease as, you know, this epsilon may not overcomes that. How do we, is there going to be a discussion in the paper or later on that addresses?
Yeah, so the kind of main reasoning there is that as long as each slot is being proposed in some sense through an auction, right? So there's an auction between the builders. Now, if the builders do face competitive pressures, like it's not an oligarchy, then you know, even if their profits over the long term are driving down, at every point it's more profitable for an individual builder to still be going with the mechanism. And as we'll see, builders really don't have any say here because you know, builders have just given their block. We are just appending to their block. But even validators, we'll see going forward that one, builders do not have any power to control how PROF transactions are being appended in most of the cases. even when they do in some cases, I'll talk about those cases, then as long as there's some competitive pressure there, there's no oligarchy there, then I think it should be still okay for every rational individual builder to support it. And for validators, I'll talk about that as well. Validators do not even see that the underlying block is PROF enriched or not, because looking forward a little bit, the validators are all only just signing on these blind headers, right? Like in PBS, you have these blind headers coming from Relay. Validators just sign on them, return the signature, and then they get the block. So validators have already given up their power of choosing the block in some sense. Okay. So from a validator's perspective in a slot, at least talking about a single slot here, which block would the validator choose, right? If the block has reward R, and if the block is enriched with PROF and has a slightly higher reward, of course, the validator is going to choose the PROF enriched block. And from a user's perspective, user could send their transactions either to the public mempool and see MEV being extracted from their transactions, or they could send their transaction through PROF, in which case MEV will not be extracted from their transactions. In fact, their transactions are private, and they could pay an epsilon fee, for example, a penny here, to the validator to incentivize inclusion for their transactions. So even here, it's actually a better path for the user to choose the PROF mechanism than not sending their transactions to PROF. So from both a user's perspective and a validator's perspective, it's incentive compatible to choose PROF. So talking a little bit about how the system is backward compatible with PBS, which is the dominant architecture on Ethereum right now to produce blocks. This is a summary of the PBS architecture. Here you have the block builders that are competing in a marketplace to supply the best block to the validator. The most important thing to note here is the validator is receiving the most profitable block possible from these builders. And the auction is conducted by a trusted auctioneer. In this case, there's a relay that conducts this auction, promises to do it in a fair way, in the sense that with integrity and with confidentiality of the builder's block, and the relay supplies the most profitable block to the validator. So the idea for PROF is we want to be backward compatible with this dominant way of producing blocks on Ethereum and still bestow the protection of PROF to ordinary users. Okay, so the key insight in PROF is we have the relay, which is getting all the PBS blocks and supplying the validator with the most profitable block, the single $ shown here. In PROF, what happens is the relay can be enhanced by just taking the most profitable block from the auction and appending the PROF bundle to it, and then supplying a more enriched or a more lucrative PROF enriched block to the validator. The PROF bundle is basically assembled by this new entity called PROF sequencer. I'll talk about PROF sequencer in a bit, but the idea is PROF sequencer is ingesting the protected order flow, giving the PROF bundle to the relay, and the relay is conducting the auction for PBS. Once it does the auction, gets the most profitable block from the auction, it simply appends the PROF bundle to the most profitable block, and the validator now has a choice. The validator could either choose the PBS block, or it could choose the enriched block with PROF, which has a little bit higher reward. And the main guarantee here from PROF is that the validator has a take it or leave it choice. What I mean by that is that if the validator does not choose the PROF enriched block, then it learns nothing about the PROF transactions. So the validator could either take the PROF enriched block and get a higher reward, but if it chooses to reject it, it learns absolutely nothing about the details of the PROF transactions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you clarify about, because there is the idea that each block has a kind of a capacity of the amount of transactions. So it's can influence, because in some case, if there is enough capacity, so I can see the idea that you always can edit the PROF bundle, but if there is not enough slots and you only can do the builder's block or whatever. So how it works in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this would have been a problem, but not for except for EIP 1559. So with EIP 1559, the idea is in steady state, at least when there's no congestion, um, a block is going to be included in the block as long as it pays the base fee, and the base fee is dynamic. So what EIP 1559 gives you is essentially the block is on average 50% full and 50% empty, and that's how the EIP mechanism works. So on average, you have sufficient room in the block as long as you're willing to pay the base fee. So that's why it's not a problem. But yes, you're right. If there was a first price auction where the builders could just pack the block with whatever transactions they want, even if they don't pay the base fee, then yes, you could crowd out the PROF transactions by just packing the builder's block full. But EIP mechanism, thankfully, tells us that you cannot always just starve the PROF transactions because the base fee will rise exponentially.
I see. So the only risk here, which is if we are not in steady state and we are in conjunction, sending a transaction in PROF may end up with not being executed.
Yeah, so the inclusion does depend on the congestion. If there's congestion, then yes, PROF transactions will not be included. If you look at Ethereum, or if you go to Etherscan, and you look at how
I know that it's unlikely. I'm just
at least right now it's quite
far away. Yeah. Okay.
Far away from congestion.
Okay. Great point. Thanks.
Okay. So why should relays adopt PROF? Well, while relays are these kind of neutral parties and trusted parties, they are still competing to have market share, right? Like they're still competing to have their blocks being accepted by the validator. And all else equal, a PROF enhanced relay is actually more competitive than than a regular relay, because it will be able to supply a higher value block than if it does not adopt PROF. As I said, the workflow, at least in this design, I'll talk about some variation of it, but in the basic design, the workflow for builders is completely unchanged. Builders can just keep sending their blocks to the relays like they do currently, and the relay would just append the PROF bundle. So the workflow for builders doesn't change. The transactions are executed exactly as it is if PROF were not there. Okay. Now, why should we trust relays? Because if the relays are honest but curious, they can still leak what the PROF transactions are. Now, in the current PBA supply chain, builders do trust the relays to not leak their blocks, because builders are competing. They don't want their blocks to be leaked to the competitors, but they are fine trusting the relays, at least so far. But for PROF, we want to have some more stronger guarantees, and we want to bolster the guarantees. So you could have TEs as defense in depth, where what happens is the PROF bundle merging, or the PROF transactions, are merged inside a TE, such that even if the relay is honest but curious, it can still not learn the PROF transactions. And as we'll see, PROF sequencer could be either a centralized entity or a decentralized protocol. But if it's a centralized entity, it's a good idea to run the PROF sequencer, which is taking the protected order flow and assembling it into a PROF bundle. It's a good idea to run that as well in a TE. So just to recap, the guarantees that a TE gives you is twofold. One, it gives you integrity. What that means is the program that's running inside an enclave is executed in a certain fashion without any tampering, even from the OS. And it gives you confidentiality, which is nobody outside the enclave, even the OS, can learn what's happening inside the TE. For PROF, what it would translate it as is the PROF transactions cannot be learned by anybody as long as the TE is secure. And the PROF bundle would be assembled in a tamper-proof way. So if you have an ordering policy such as first come, first serve for PROF bundle, then it will be assembled without any tampering in the required ordering policy. And the guarantees that some of the TEs give you is this guarantee of remote attestation, where the TE can actually prove that indeed it's running a given program inside the enclave. And that gives you the integrity property that As long as you trust the attestation, then you know that the T is running a particular program. There are many examples of TEs out there. There's AWS Nitro. One of the most famous is Intel SGX. A new version is Intel TDX, and so on. AMD also is coming up with its own TEs. But the idea is TEs are basically these trusted third parties, and you could trust them for both confidentiality and integrity. And the reason we use TEs here is because they are also very inexpensive with respect to computation, unlike MPC or zero knowledge proofs. So you could append the prof bundle with very little overhead. As I'll talk about the overheads later in the presentation. There are some serious provisos here. There are some serious vulnerabilities that have been discovered in TEs. But as I mentioned, TEs are only being used as a defense in depth. If you trust the relay, as builders already do, then you don't need TEs. They're already being, even though there are provisos and there are these vulnerabilities, they're already being used or being planned for the MEV supply chain. Most notably, for example, Suave heavily relies on TEs, and the industry is already embracing the use of TEs. Okay. If there are any questions so far, I can take those questions, because now I'm going to dive into the details of the PROF design and how the workflow for PROF transaction is. Okay.
Just a quick note. Sorry, just a quick note. If you're in the audience, you can either use the chat, use the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask your questions.
Yeah. So I have a question. Do you think if validators, let's say, have the power to execute two or three blocks in a row, what about between block MEV that they observe? Yeah, so they're still going to have kind of an advantage in terms of like maybe doing arbitrage or stuff after the.
Yeah, but that would be in the next block, so that's okay. The idea is the PROF transactions are protected in the sense that they don't learn about the PROF transactions until they're finalized. So either they can take the PROF transactions, finalize them, or if they choose to not take them, then they learn nothing about it. But the idea is they cannot tamper with them in the sense that they can't front run them, they can't learn anything about them or manipulate their ordering, even if they have multiple blocks.
I see. I just think about okay, yeah, we can speak about this.
Yeah, okay. So now going forward with the details of the design, let me very quickly tell you about how the current PBS workflow works, how the current PBS workflow is structured. So you have these searchers and builders out of protocol entities that have their own private transactions coming in, possibly. They have also access to the public mempool, of course, and they're creating these blocks that are being sent to the relay as the second step. The relays send these bids to the validator, which are blind bids. They do not reveal the block to the validator. They only reveal what the bid for that block is. The validator signs off on a random blind header for the block, and then the relay reveals the actual block contents after getting the signature. The idea here is that if the validator kind of reneges on its commitment and proposes a different block, then the validator can be slashed because you have a signature of the validator which serves as a proof of equivocation. So the validator has cryptoeconomic guarantee that it will only propose the block that it has promised to propose by the means of the signed header. So in some sense, the builders are trusting the relay for not revealing their block payload before there's a commitment from the validator, and the validator is trusting the relay that the underlying block is in fact valid, and they're just signing off on the random header. Okay. Now, here's the design for PROF. As I mentioned, it's the kind of workflow for builders remains unchanged. Essentially, at the relay, what happens is the PROF sequencer sends an encrypted transaction bundle, PROF bundle, to the relay. The relay just takes the most profitable block from the auction, which is the B early block, the blue block here, appends the PROF bundle, creates the PROF enriched block, And now it will produce also a prof enriched bid, right? Like what's the R plus epsilon bid. And then if there are any meanwhile, any new blocks that have come into the auction, such as the B late block, the yellow block, then it will choose whether the prof enriched bid is still higher or not, and then supply the most profitable bid to the validator. Once it receives the signature from the validator, and if the prof enriched block is chosen, only then the prof enriched block is revealed to the validator. Until the signature is received, the sig H here, until the signature is received from the validator, the prof bundle merger does not reveal the prof transactions to anybody. So this is the way prof enforces the take it or leave it guarantee, that the prof transactions are not revealed until there is a commitment, the signature of the validator given to the prof bundle merger. As I said, the prof bundle merger can be run inside a T to get additional protection from an honest but curious relay. Okay. As you can see, there's already some inclusion likelihood kind of trade-offs here. As Neer already mentioned, if the block is already full, there might be some inclusion kind of trade-off there. The other one, as you can see here, is while you are merging the prof bundle, if the bid improves in the auction, the yellow block is much more profitable, then the prof block will not be chosen. So essentially, the timeline here is you run these two paths in parallel. One is the PBS path, that is the current path. The other one is the prof path, where you do the MEV auction just like the PBS path, but at the very end, you end the auction a little bit early and you add the prof bundle to it. And then you choose the best of the two paths and reply to the validator. So there's this delta latency that is there in the prof bundle merging, and that delta latency kind of causes the auction to end a little bit early. So as I said, if you assume that there are, for example, in Ethereum, the 12 seconds is the duration of the auction, and 12 minus delta would be the duration of the auction for prof. And this 12 minus delta essentially leads to a less profitable block sometimes. And that's the latency penalty term that we will see later on. But essentially, this delta is imposing some sort of latency. But on the other hand, the prof transactions are paying some fee as well. So there's this kind of like, break-even equation going on here, where the profit from the auction might be a little bit less, but then it's compensated by the fee that is coming from the prof transactions. So essentially, if the prof enriched block is to be chosen, you need to analyze the fee that's coming from the prof transactions and potentially what might be the latency penalty for the auction. So let's first look at the latency penalty in the auction. So this is the data from March to April of this year from, I think, Flashbot's relay, but the data is kind of similar for other relays as well. And this data shows you, this graph shows you the latency penalty as a function of the latency. So if you end the auction a little bit early, for example, if you end the auction 85 milliseconds early, then in 90% of the slots, which is the red line here, you will have the winning bid would be a little bit less than the bid it would have otherwise been. So about 0.003 ETH is the latency penalty of ending the auction 85 milliseconds earlier in 90% of the slots. Are there any questions about this graph? So essentially, this graph is showing you that if you take a certain amount of latency in appending the prof transactions, you have to compensate that much penalty through the prof fee for the prof enriched block to be chosen by the validator. Okay. So the inclusion likelihood, as I mentioned, can be modeled as what's the probability that the fees from prof outweighs the latency penalty of the auction. So if bids is the auction process, and you let the auction process run up to the time T0, which is the original time, versus if you run it only up to the time T0 minus delta, then the latency penalty is the difference of the two. And the probability with which fees compensates for it is the inclusion likelihood. Now, fees from prof bundle can again be broken down into the gas that is used in the prof bundle and the price that the prof bundle pays. The price is again as a fraction of the base fee. So F is the base fee and gamma is the overhead on top of the base fee. So the total fees is the total amount of gas multiplied by the gas price, which is gamma F. And The latency penalty here is a function of delta. It also depends on the gas used in the PROF bundle, because if the PROF bundle is big, you are using a lot of gas, doing a lot of execution, then the delta might be a little bit higher. So essentially, there's a relationship here between a three-way relationship between the inclusion likelihood alpha, the gas used in the PROF bundle G, and the gamma, which is the overhead that you're willing to pay in the PROF transactions. Okay. So this is the three-dimensional relationship between these three variables: the inclusion likelihood, how big is the PROF bundle as in terms of the gas used, and how much fee you are willing to pay for the PROF transactions. So as you can see, the higher the bigger the PROF bundle, the less overhead there is. So for the same amount of inclusion likelihood. And roughly, for example, if the PROF bundle is about, say, 750K gas, then you only need about 10% of the base fee, which is about currently less than 1 GUI. You only need about that much amount of fees from PROF transactions to guarantee more than 95% inclusion likelihood. This is again computed on the same data between March and April. And this relationship is similar for all the relays, all the major relays. So the takeaway from this graph is you have high inclusion likelihood of PROF for a very minimal fee, and you don't need the PROF bundle to be huge. What that means is there's no cold start problem. Even if you have, say, about 500K gas worth of PROF bundle, a few transactions, the PROF bundle, they can pay enough fee to guarantee their inclusion.
Can you go one back? So I have a question. So what do you have in mind when a user going to use PROF is going to pay base fee transaction, which will going to be burned, right? Is going to pay some fee that's going to the validator. So the validator get, but the G is kind of extra tip that you pay to the validator to include this bundle in order to make it, because in some sense you can think about it that I can find a G anytime that will be profitable to edit PROF to latency, right?
Yeah, so G is the gas used, which is like the size of the PROF bundle. So if your size is PROF bundle size is small, then you can compensate for it by increasing your gamma. So gamma is the fee that you're paying, and G is the size of your bundle. So if you have a lot of transactions, each transaction doesn't need to pay a lot of fee. So essentially, we are computing the cumulative fee, G, gamma, F.
Oh yeah, okay, I see. But what I'm saying is that in some sense, what I'm trying to say is that even if you have a small amount of transaction, you always can tip
exactly
validator in a way that will want to include your
exactly. So there's flexibility there. So if you have just one transaction that's going to go through PROF, then yes, you can increase your tips to incentivize your inclusion. That's always there. That's definitely a very important point in practice and for deployment. This graph is just showing that, if your tolerance is not, if you only want to pay 10% of the base fee, then yes, you need enough size. But yeah, if you're willing to go up to 22%, 25%, you don't need too many other transactions with you. Okay. Let me not go into this graph. Okay. So now I'll talk about going a step further and talking about redistribution of MEV. So some of you might be already familiar with this redistribution paradigm coming in, where any arbitrage opportunities that are created by users' transactions, the profit from those opportunities is kind of redistributed back to the users. And I'll now talk about how PROF can be kind of slightly tweaked to obtain redistribution for users as well. So this is just a simple illustration of how redistribution happens. There are two exchanges. Alice is buying on one exchange. An arbitrager will arbitrage the two exchanges, get some profit, and return some portion of the profit back to Alice and keeps the remaining portion for itself. Okay. So PROF can also incorporate redistribution with some slight modifications. So here, as you can see, 1, 2, and 3 steps are similar to PROF. So the PROF share proceeds similarly to PROF, where you have the PROF bundle, get the signature from the validator. And now once you have the signature from the validator, what you could actually do is just release the entire PROF enriched block to the public. And then you can you can have a backrunning auction, this step 4 here, where arbitragers can actually backrun the PROF transactions and provide value back to the users. And then you can create a new header for this backrun block, and then get the validator to opt for that if the validator so prefers. Here, you would require some slight modification for the validator. Now the validator is signing 2 things. It's signing the original PROF enrich block. And then if a more valuable backrun opportunity is created, then it's also kind of signing the new block. But except for that, the idea here is that you can also have redistribution happening in PROF. And the nice thing here is that you can actually release the entire PROF transactions safely. Because you already have a commitment from the validator, there's no risk of the validator proposing something else, somebody kind of stealing the PROF transactions, front running them, because you already have a commitment. In some sense, this part of the block is already pre-confirmed by the validator. The only thing that can happen is now more backrun transactions can be added after that. So this is the PROF share design. And just comparing a little bit to the existing redistribution mechanisms out there, namely MEV share and MEV blocker, which essentially do something similar, but they don't have this strong guarantee of commitment from the validator. They just try to backrun users' transactions. And essentially, they have this kind of trade-off between leaking some hints about users' transactions and attracting backrunners to backrun those transactions. So there's this trade-off between privacy for users or protection for users and the attractiveness of backrunning them, because you can't backrun them unless you know something about them in MEV share and MEV blocker. And this is already widespread in industry to the point that the order flow that's coming through MEV share and MEV blocker is actually quite pivotal in deciding the winner of a majority of auctions. Now, the benefits of PROF share, if you compare against, say, for example, MEV share and MEV blocker, is that the transactions, as I said, are completely private. You don't need to have that trade-off. You can keep the transactions completely private until the validator commits to including them, and then you can release the transactions for backrunning. And as a result, you can have the backrunning of auction be more efficient because you're releasing everything about them, so that it can be done completely off-chain. It need not be done through smart contracts. The other thing is the PROF share users get to keep almost all of the backrunning profits because the validator is already committed to including them. You don't need to incentivize the validator further by cutting in the validator as well into the redistribution profits. And the final is we are not doing backrunning of each transaction individually. We are backrunning them all together. And what that means is transactions can internalize any backrunning, like any organic backrunning. So you're essentially backrunning the net effect of the PROF bundle and not individual transactions. As a result, multiple PROF transactions can organically backrun each other and benefit from each other. This is the general guideline for all the redistribution mechanisms, that they should be bundling as many user transactions as possible and then backrun them together so that there's some organic backrunning that's happening there. We also do some economic utility analysis of these 3 different mechanisms: PROF, PROF share, and MEV share. The model is quite simple. You have 2 dexes. You have a dex, which is based on a constant product AMM, and you have an external market like a centralized exchange, which has a constant price, like it has infinite liquidity. And you're basically arbitragers are arbitraging across the centralized exchange and the decentralized exchange. And we have this parameter called demand ratio, which is standard in the literature. The idea here is demand ratio is essentially a cap on how much net demand there is relative to the volume. So if there are too many buys or too many sells, then the demand ratio is high. If the trades are balanced of the users, then the demand ratio is approximately equal to 0. And as you would expect, when the demand ratio is close to 0, essentially there's more chances for organic backrunning. Then PROF and PROF share shine and compared to MEV share. You can see that PROF share, the first takeaway is PROF share is always better than MEV share or PROF because you're also protecting the users, no front running is happening, and you're also redistributing value to the users. And the second takeaway is PROF is better than even redistribution mechanism. So you're not even doing redistribution PROF, but it's still better than MEV share because of this organic backrunning effect. And as you can see, there are many blocks where the demand ratio is in the regime, the low demand ratio regime, where organic backrunning can happen in PROF. Okay. The other things that I would like to quickly mention with respect to flexibility in PROF, the biggest one that some people might have misconceptions about is whether there is a centralized sequencer or just one sequencer in PROF or like one ordering policy. There can actually be multiple sequencers. So you could have multiple PROF sequencers supplying multiple PROF bundles, and you could just choose among them. Or you could even have sequential compositions. So you can have multiple PROF bundles being appended to the same block to have more enrichment happening. And these PROF sequencers need not be centralized entities. For the purposes, it was just like a black box, but they could be decentralized protocols. And all the large line of academic literature on fair ordering, blind ordering, all of that can be deployed through PROF. So essentially, PROF can serve as a vehicle for all those decentralized protocols to be deployed in practice. But if you wish for the PROF sequencer to be centralized, we suggest that you do it through a T, but there's nothing preventing from the PROF sequencer to be a decentralized protocol producing the PROF bundle. And as I said, it can support any ordering policy. So if you have a first come, first serve policy, that's fine, or any other ordering policy is also fine. The main idea is PROF is just allowing these protected transactions to be appended in a way such that they don't face competition from other transactions, but rather they are just attached to the most profitable block. Okay. Very last thing is the hybrid deployment of PROF. If the relays are optimistic in the sense that the relays, some relays nowadays are not even simulating the transactions. They just kind of trust the builder that the builder is supplying them with valid blocks. These relays would just pass on the bid directly to the validator without even validating the block. In that case, we don't have enough time to simulate the PROF transaction, merge the PROF transaction with the block, and calculate the updated state and so on. In that case, you can run the PROF bundle merger at the builder instead of the relay. So the builder can run the PROF bundle merger there itself and can supply directly the PROF enriched block to an optimistic relay. And I can discuss more about ePBS, but if you enshrine PBS into the protocol, then again, PROF can work by just doing the enrichment at the builder rather than at the relay. With that, I would like to conclude that PROF is a very simple backward compatible mechanism that protects users from most harmful forms of MEV and accounts for rational validators. The endgame thesis that we have in mind for PROF is that transactions that are looking for protection should go through PROF. So all transactions that are looking for protection should go through PROF. And transactions that want the top of the priority, so these could be transactions that are doing arbitrage between centralized exchange and decentralized exchange, those transactions can go through the gauntlet of the auction. But the transactions from ordinary users do not need to run the gauntlet of auctions. They can just go through a protected route. And essentially, the final endgame is most transactions in the block would be built through PROF. We are actually, I can talk more about it, but we are already in talks with a few major relays who are very interested in deploying PROF. The one quick thing that I would like to mention, I'm happy to discuss this in detail as well, is essentially this combination of auction at the top and then a protected route at the bottom, and so essentially also nullifies this externality of latency racing in pure first come first serve protocols. So if you only had the block being built entirely through temporal fair ordering, then you would have some latency racing. But if you auction off the top part of the block through PBS, as PROF does, then you also nullify those latency racing pressure, because those transactions would anyway have to go through the auction. With that, I would like to conclude. You could visit the website here. There are some FAQs there, which are very interesting. A demo as well that you can watch. I had planned a demo. I had planned a live demo to show here. If there's interest, I can show that demo now. But there's also an RFP that's very generously sponsored by Uniswap for productionizing PROF and taking it into from a prototype to production ready. And the paper is just out. I would highly encourage you to read the paper. There are many more details because we wanted the mechanism and the architecture to be very practical. So there are a lot more details in the paper.